Good morning, everybody. Hopefully everybody's having a good session and day thus far. Really excited to kick off the So You Want to Be a Board Member session, which is diving into a little bit of the complexities and why boards exist, what you should do at the earliest stages, the scaling stages, and then actually in the back half of the session here today, we're going to break out and do a case study scenario of a very challenging situation with many different perspectives. So I think it'll be really fun. But let me first introduce our speakers today. First, I'll go with Gail, who brings great experience to the conversation, having been a board director at 5 public companies. Many of you know Irobot, EMC, TJX, Hartford Life, and EG&G, which now is part of PerkinElmer. And then prior to that, Gail was part of many organizations and had the opportunity to report into boards, work with boards as a chief financial officer of a few companies. And she brings great experience specifically around financial accounting matters for complex scenarios, capital allocation, business transformation, and oversight of corporate governance. So, well, welcome, Gail. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Richard.
And on the earlier stage spectrum, as well as an investor, I'm very excited to introduce Jen Lum here, who not only has been a serial founder, started companies like Adelphic and Forge AI, but also has been in the boardroom as an advisor to founders in their earlier days. And then now is actually launching a venture fund and will be taking investor role seats on boards. She's been a great member of the Boston ecosystem, prolific angel investor, so many of you may know her from that. And also as a EIR at Harvard Business School. So welcome, Jen, as well.
Thanks, Richard.
Great. So maybe as we dive into this, I think what would maybe be helpful is to tell people a little bit about where you're coming from, your experience working with boards and in your career. Would love to use that as kind of a context setting for the discussion today. So maybe, Gail, you want to kick us off here?
Yeah. One benefit that I had in getting on a board and understanding what boards did is, as CFO of Eastern Gas and Fuel, I participated in board meetings. I presented at board meetings. I worked with the CEO in agenda setting. So I had a wonderful exposure to boards. Now, fortunately, this was a quote good board, but this was back in the late 70s and early 80s, and so I always encourage people, if they can, to get some experience with boards by being in the presence of boards. And that could mean presenting to your own board or sitting in on board meetings or serving on not-for-profit boards or even state and local boards, because you really get a sense that boards are not operators. Now, I'm speaking from large public company boards, and Jennifer will have a different perspective. But that's how I got started. And someone who was on the board of Eastern Gas and Fuel was the CEO of Houghton Mifflin. And after a couple of years, he asked me if I would be interested in being on his board. And so that kind of gets the ball going. But my experience is on large public company boards. I've been on not-for-profits and state boards and commissions and local ones, but that's my perspective. And so I've been at that far end of the boards where, every day there's some board brought to attention for misbehaving as opposed to doing well. But I just think that's an important context for you to understand. My experiences as a CFO, which that alone makes me an attractive potential board member, because every board has to have qualified financial experts, and I've led lots of audit committees. So that's my background.
Oh, thank you, Gail. And Jen, you want to give us a little bit about your background as well?
Yeah, sure. So similar to Gail, my path to a board member initially began as an operator, where the first step was being one of the people that was always very involved in the preparation of the board materials. with the next step being interaction with the board, presenting at board meetings, also similar to Gail. Then the next step was, as I co-founded a couple companies, I took on a founder board member role. And then I guess my most recent step was taking on an independent board director role, which started off through me being an advisor to the company and then being invited to transition from an advisor to an official independent board member. And now currently through BioSpring, the venture firm that I've co-founded, as I lead deals, I will also take on board seats through those investor roles.
That's great. And so you guys can all see a bit of diverse experience, not only at the tail end of the spectrum where companies are in the public stages in the public arena, but also the private early stage world, which in many ways operate in the same way. But I'd love to learn a little bit about how do you guys see the backgrounds that an ideal board member has? There's such a spread of types of companies, but is there a common skill set that a board member needs?
Well, I think a very important quality that any board member has to have is deep expertise in some area. Okay, ideally on your board, and you would have people who represent many different types of business experience. All right, so you would want a financial person, you would want someone with experience in your industry, as long as there's not a competitive aspect to it. You'd want people who understand go-to-market. So there's the functional expertise that you want to have, and then there's the industry, and then the very, very important skill set is your interpersonal skills. Again, speaking from a large company, you're not there to micromanage the operations, but you're there to be engaged in the approval of strategy, the allocation of resources, the determination of budgets. You're there as someone who makes sure that all the legal and compliance issues are done, that the tone at the top is what you want it to be from an ethics perspective. And very importantly, to hire, maybe fire, work with the CEO and the senior leadership. So if you think about those aspects, an ideal board member would have familiarity in many of those areas, okay? And so as people are thinking about how do I become a candidate, one, I say, really work on your interpersonal skills. Be a good listener, be someone who can ask insightful questions, be open to other people's views, and develop an expertise in your industry or in your discipline. So when I was on the EMC board, for example, I'm not a techie, I confess. I was the one who, as a CFO at Y2K, said to the tech people at Houghton Mifflin, "What's with this EMC? Why are they charging so much for storage? And I think this is highway robbery." So I have been a user of technology, but I think it's important that you look at the composition of the board, and does it have the basics that it needs to be, and also an effective board is one where the CEO values the board and works with the board. I've fortunately never been on a company where this has happened, but I've heard that it has, that the CEO has to approve of any communication between a board member and somebody in management. If I heard that, I would immediately, that's not a company that I would be interested in, not just because I thought it was important, and I do think it's important for boards and management and people in the company to interact, but because I would be concerned that that might be the style that the CEO had for running the business. He may say to the head of marketing, "Don't go talk to the finance person, come and talk to me," and something like that. So an effective board starts with the individual having the skills and work style to be a collaborative board member, and the intelligence, and also that the board itself, from the CEO down to the members, can work well together.
Great. And Jen, from the early stage perspective, when do you think is too early to create a board? How should you think about a board creation at the early stages, and even the composition if you are going to create one?
Yeah, I think certainly as soon as a company has institutional funding, I think there should be a board of directors that's implemented in order to have proper governance over the company and the management team. I do think that the time factor and the time horizon is such an important factor in designing a board. As a company is getting off the ground, as you think about who are the right board members to put around the table to ensure that the company can graduate to the next few levels of success, those board members that can be very effective in helping the management team make that happen are likely a very different set of board members than those who should be in place in order to take a company public. And on the same path, those people could also be very different from those who are on a very established corporate board where the corporation's looking 10, 20 years out. But as a founder, I've always found it valuable to have a board of directors in place. I found it very healthy to have that routine gathering, discussion, and all of the upfront work. Yes, it does take time, but I've always found it to be a valuable exercise to ensure that as a team and as a board that we are both aligned, but also tracking to the right milestones.
Yeah.
One thing that I've noticed lately, I do work in connecting companies with women board members, women candidates. And one of the things that I've noticed is that startups and people like you, Richard, or Jennifer, will call and they say, we need a seasoned financial person to give credibility to the street that we will be run in the appropriate way for a public company. So that sense as they're getting ready to go public, that they're feeling that they need the credibility of an experienced board member in that process.
Yeah. And even as we were talking before this session, I think the board composition and the emphasis on diversity, as we talked about Goldman Sachs, is only going to bank and take companies out the door that have female board members and directors, which I think is great. So as we evolve as a company, Gail, I would love your perspective on how should the composition of the board change across time, as you would see it.
Well, I'll use two examples. One is Irobot, and the other one is EMC. I joined the board of Irobot at a time when it originally had three founders, and one founder, Rodney, had already left, and the second founder, Helene, was getting ready to leave, and I was going to be filling that slot, if you will. And yes, I would be replacing the only other woman on the board. But when I joined the board, Paul Sagan, who also was on the EMC board with me and was on the Irobot board, he said they really want to add more seasoned people on boards, on public boards. So on the board were the founders previously and the major investors. And because they had a large military component, they had people who were former Secretary of the Army. So that was kind of the composition of the board. But Colin Engel, as the one surviving founder, he knew he needed to make changes. And so he had a transition period of, I don't think it was more than 5 years, where he gradually changed the composition of the board. One of the first things was they were getting out of the military business and just being in the consumer electronics field with their Roombas, which I highly recommend. Anyhow, so it was obvious that the people, even though they were great board members, the expertise they brought was from the military side. And I found that very interesting when they were still in the military business. I had no idea of the complexity, the timeline, and the buys, et cetera. So that was the first thing. And then, you know, as I said, I replaced the founder. And then gradually the investors, the individual investors, they chose to get out. I mean, company had already gone public. So there was a period of 5 years where almost every year there was someone changing. So both the people who had were a natural fit in the beginning, the investors and the military people, were not viewed as having the critical skills to go forward. So I came in, I mean, I was a CFO, so there are always hot topics and hot people to come bring on, but also consumer electronics. So they brought on a woman who was the president of Keurig coffee maker. So, and then another person who was from, had done a lot of consulting in this area. And so, and then he brought in somebody who had a lot of international experience. So it was a well thought out strategy that Colin, with the board and with the governance committee of the board, looked at what are the issues the company is facing down the road. Who on the board brings the skill set? So this is the matrix they often talk about. Of what are the skills we need, and then here's our board members, who has what skill, and importantly, where's the hole? Where's the hole? So one, they knew they needed to bring in seasoned governance people, and Paul and I were that, and then adding the consumer electronics and then other electronics. So I think in building a board, you really want to start with where are you as a company today? Where are you going in the next X years? And what's missing on your board, and how do you then develop relationships with those people? And EMC was similar. It had already been public, but Jack Egan, who was the son of the founder, I went on right after Dick Egan left, but it was still pretty much thought of as a private company. And even Jack would jokingly say to me after meetings, "Gail, I'm so glad you're on this and you're dealing with all these issues with the SEC and the finance and this." And I said, "And Jack, I'm so glad you're here because you know the technology so deep." So it's not, does any one person have all the qualities, because they don't. It's what do you need? And this is what founders need. And founders, many times, appropriately so, have a hard time thinking that some of these people would add value. But I'll leave that for Jennifer to talk about.
Yeah, Jennifer, what's your lens coming from the startup world? And you've decided to add people to your own board. Tell me a bit about that and how you made those decisions.
Around building a board and adding to a board?
From the early days, how did you choose your investors who would be board members? How did you, think about board composition from, starting with none to building?
Yeah, I guess the step before, or sort of the necessary step that leads to the investor being on the board is, in the companies that I co-founded, I always felt that it was pretty important, and I always really wanted to work with investors who had operating experience, knowing that they would end up on the board and would have the perspective, of course, as a professional investor, but also they would have been through the trenches of being an operator themselves. And so I really valued that in seeking out the investors to work with through my companies, and had the good fortune to work with you and Michael through one of those companies, both as investors and in the boardroom. As we sought out independent board members, I think we really focused on individuals who'd held leadership roles at companies that very successfully scaled to meaningful levels. because, obviously that's what we were aspiring to get to, but the perspective of bringing that into the boardroom to help us talk through strategic initiatives as we were growing and scaling is something that we thought was quite important.
That's great. Yeah, and I do think, having been a operator as well as a investor, now board member in early stage startups, I have to tell you, it creates such a different level of empathy for the founders and the way they have to report and think about building the business. And I think that's just fundamental. On the other side, I also find that operating investors, once you've built in the past, tend to want to get their hands in the mud a little bit more than you may want. And so to that end, I'd love to talk a little bit about what are effective boards. You've sat on many boards. What do you think creates a dynamic that yields an effective board relationship and operating cadence? Okay, I'll turn this on to you in terms of what do you think creates the right dynamic, or where do you see the wrong dynamic potentially emerge?
I think the most important factor in developing an effective board is the CEO. The CEO sets the tone for the board. The wise founder, CEO, whoever, appreciates that his or her board members have had different experiences, have had successes and failures, and he or she uses those people as sounding boards, sometimes as sounding boards in the meeting as a whole, but very importantly, outside of meetings. That CEO will call people and run something by them. So that's like number one why I think it's challenging for successful CEOs, successful founders, to acknowledge that and to feel comfortable with that. So many times we have to act as though we have the answers to everything. And that's just, as you move up in leadership, people expect that you're going to have the answers. You don't, and many people know you don't, but it's like, do you as a CEO feel comfortable reaching out and asking people? And the other thing in an effective board meeting is you have discussion and not presentations. That means that you need board members who do their homework before the board meeting. And trust me, that can mean hundreds of pieces of paper to look through. And if you're on committees and the audit committee, you have an awful lot to absorb, which I think then becomes, and I think Jennifer said she had been presenting to boards, it really becomes important for the presenters, the CFOs, the general counsel, the head of businesses, to prepare the right level of information for the board before the meeting, and not then at the meeting go through slide by slide, but say, all right, you've gotten this number. And it may mean a 2-page summary, which then can allude to the 500 pages that come afterwards. So effective board meetings are ones where they're well thought out about what is the goal of what we want today and how do we structure it so that the CEO isn't the one talking all the time. The CEO raises the issues and lets the dynamics among the board members happen. And, sometimes it's better than others. A couple years ago, they started a requirement, the SEC, that all boards must meet, I don't remember how many times, 3 times a year in private session without management. Now, if you think about that, that doesn't sound like a very good idea that they are only going to meet 3 times a year. So on my boards at the time, we often started the beginning of the meeting without management, talked about either something we might have seen in the pre-reading or something that was on our mind that we wanted to be sure and cover in the meeting. And then at the end had another meeting just to independent board members. And then the lead independent director would go and personally talk with the CEO. So I've watched over my decades on boards some best practices come up. The skills matrix is good. This idea of having private sessions without the board, but then communicating with the CEO, and also the strength of committees, that the public company boards, their audit committee, their governance committee, and their compensation committees. There's a lot of work that gets done.
I'll add three quick things. So I think, one characteristic that is very much appreciated in boardrooms and in board settings is you can tell when there's a high degree of trust in the boardroom amongst the board members. And as Gail said, I think that starts with the CEO and the CEO establishing those trusted relationships with each individual board member, but also encouraging the board members to develop trust outside of the boardroom between themselves. And I think that leads to very healthy discussion in the boardroom, but also ideally it leads to a high degree of objectivity, which is so key, especially in critical situations where personal points of view and feelings can come into play. Maintaining objectivity is a huge factor. And then the second thing that I've appreciated in certain board settings is diversity of thought. And I think that does come from designing a board and assembling a board in a way where you have people with different skill sets, different experiences coming into the room together and just seeing things from different perspectives. It's very helpful.
Let me add there, because I know you're going to do a breakout session, and unfortunately I can't be there, but in the breakout session, there are assigned roles. The CEO, the CFO, the independent director, and different people, all right? It's very important to what Jennifer was saying that, as a CFO, people always expected me to come in with some comment on finance. And when I'd come in on something else, they're like, whoa, didn't expect that from her, but that's good, So when you're in this exercise and you put the hat of the CFO or the investor on, you're going to kind of get into that role for yourself, but it's really important that you listen to what the head of revenue is saying, or this, because people come with different experiences and different maybe objectives or ways of solving issues. And the key is, can you get those things on the table and then have a good discussion about how do you finally come to a plan? Sorry, Richard, I probably led to your...
No, I think this is fantastic. And, I also love the thinking around how to be effective on boards with the pre-work. I always think so much of the efficacy of a board is not in the meeting. It's all the context around it, the pre-work, the discussions that happen, all of it. But I want to make sure we jump into some Q&A that everybody's been loading up. And I'll start with Doug May's question here quickly, which is, how did you get the first board gig? How do you think about getting these? Did you seek it out? Did they seek you out? Would love how you guys think of people getting involved in boards in any context.
Well, I explained that I was asked to join the board of Houghton Mifflin because the CEO of Houghton Mifflin was on the board of Eastern Gas, where I was the CFO, and he got to know me there. Getting on your first board is the most difficult one. But that was it. And then I got on another board through another member of the Eastern board, and then it just kind of rolls. But so I guess they sought me out. But this is a topic we could have another long discussion on. I'll let Jennifer talk.
Yeah, sure. So I guess in order, I had two investor board member roles, then two founder board member roles. But the first independent board role that I took on was one that progressed from me initially being an investor in the company, then an advisor to the company, and then being invited to join the board as an independent board director. And I think that progression happened because over time I became a trusted thought partner to the CEO. and happened to have operating experience in the sector that this company was operating in. And as they were growing the board and added a second independent seat, I think the CEO and then the other board members agreed that I may be able to provide helpful perspective around the table.
Yeah. And I'll add a little bit of my own experience here too, which is often the way I've seen it develop for people getting involved in the board is that they're often a right-hand consultant to the CEO in some form, or is very experienced in some dimension, like we were talking earlier. They had a really unique lens, or just the trusted ear to the founder, and so they get involved in maybe a board observer capacity or kind of a shadow board member, can attend board meetings. And then if that relationship is so successful, they can become an independent. Usually it is through the independent role that people are getting involved formally in boards, because investors, and if you're investing, you want to have that representation. And then the founders generally want to be representing the company themselves. So usually the independency is the one that gets formalized. So hopefully that answered your question, Doug. And a similar one, actually, let me see. Oh, shoot, sorry, I answered the wrong question. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, cool. So great question from Jillian as well, which is, we talked a little bit about how do you jump into directorship, but let's talk about the roles, the various type of subcommittees that can form across the journey, whether advisory or fiduciary. And Gail, do you want to talk to this one a little bit, given you have such good experience around the various subcommittees of the boards?
Well, I will let Jennifer talk about the evolution because it is very different being on an advisory board and then being on the actual board of a private company to being on the board of a public company. Although I truly believe your responsibilities are similar, how you behave in terms of pre-board meetings, discussions with people is very, very, very similar. On a public company board, your liability is greater. You have fiduciary responsibilities. You are expected to be an independent board member. Now, there may be on the board non-independent people, which now tend to be just the CEO. But you're expected to represent all of the stakeholders, not just the shareholders. There's been legislation on that in recent years where you are supposed to take into account the employees, the suppliers, the community, etc. So your job is to represent all of those people and the employees, etc. Now, obviously, you have a very important job to make sure the company is run in a financially sound and good direction. You're not there just to say, oh, let's just give away a lot of money to philanthropy and, pay everybody the top of their range. And, oh, yeah, we won't have any earnings because no earnings, no company. So you do have to balance a lot of things there. You are liable. You can go to jail. I was always thinking that, and you may have remembered that in the Enron case, although you're probably all too young, but it was a case where finally the CEO went to jail, but the CFO went. And many times the CFO was the person who went to jail first. And the reason was that the CFO signed the financial statements. This was before the requirement for CEOs also to sign it. And they were the ones that were making public statements about the company and what might happen. So they were on the record, if you will, of providing information. And so, but now everybody can be sued because everybody signs the 10K, et cetera. But there are heightened expectations from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the stock exchanges for public company people. So it is, it's not a role to take lightly, I guess is what I would say. Jennifer, maybe you want to talk about the advisory roles.
Yeah, I'll touch on making the jump and just share a few ideas there. So, a lot, I think I think Gail mentioned this earlier. Often board seats are, the situation is that you're invited into the board. It's not that you're going and necessarily seeking out a specific role. And because of that, specifically within the early stage community, if it's something that you are very interested in, I strongly suggest that you start socializing that intent with founders, executives, investors, and people who are actively sitting on early stage boards, so that as board seats come up with companies that they're involved in, there's a chance that they may think of you. There's another step that I took and that I've seen several friends take, sort of as an intermediary step towards taking on a corporate board role, and that's taking on nonprofit board roles, which can help familiarize you in some of the processes and procedures that boards of directors work through formally. And while it's not a for-profit board, it is something that can potentially help your resume and credibility.
And it's also an opportunity for other people to get to know you. Building your own personal network is key. And it means that you're willing to give of your time and your value to others. And you are then recognized as someone who is maybe a thought leader. So participating, you may think it's ridiculous, but in Zoom calls with people, I've done that on things when in a Zoom call, I thought, now that's a very interesting person. I think I want to follow up and talk to him. But you need to be visible. And visibility comes in a lot of different flavors, but you have to be willing to give too, so that someone would say, this is a very thoughtful person. And so I agree totally with Jennifer. I think not-for-profits are important. I was on the United Way in my early days, and that organization had the leaders of every company in town on it. So how do you build your own personal network is key. And you build it by being who you are and being visible, participating in panels, going to Zoom meetings, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think getting into what I call like aggregating points of Mass TLC, one of our partners, does this board ready boot camp, which Gail actually is a part of as well. And they are very helpful as creating an aggregating point where people get the training, and then I think also the exposure to potential places in the ecosystem where they can plug in. But I do think, at the end of the day, one of the easiest ways to get involved, to demonstrate that expertise as a board member, is get involved in nonprofits that you really care about, and that, to Gail's point as well, gives you the first stepping stone, which demonstrates that experience. So, great question, Jillian. And I think one more question from Isioma, which I think is similar in that if there's a company you really want to serve on the board, how do you express that interest? To, Jen, wave your hand, work your network. How do you think about expressing your interest to be involved in a board to a founder or otherwise?
You put yourself in circumstances where that person might see you. If it's a cold call and you don't know them and they don't know you, I certainly don't recommend that you call them up and say, my name is Mary Smith and I'd really like to be on your board. That doesn't work. But if there is a company that you really would like to be on, to know more about, let's not start by saying you want to be on the board of. Put yourself in circumstances where maybe the presenters of that, people who are the executives present, or be in industry segments that, if there's a healthcare forum on something, be there. But really, I have not found it beneficial to let them know you are interested. On the other hand, if you do your research and you see that your next door neighbor is in that company or some relationship, no harm in saying, yeah, I'd really like to know more about that company. And you don't start out by, I want to be on your board. Jennifer, you know more about that than I do.
No, completely agree. Completely agree. I would say similar to sales, you'd probably want to take a surround sound approach to learning about the company and trying to establish ties and connectivity to the company. But I can't think of any cases where an individual has just gone directly to the CEO and stated that they would love to be on the board and had that happen at the flip of a switch.
Now, I have to say, as a public company, if you're a shareholder, you can nominate anybody to be a board member, including yourself. Now, I don't recall more than 3 times, if ever, that an individual wrote to the general counsel and said, I'd like to be considered. And then you are obligated to do the due diligence, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's not the same thing as saying an activist. When the activists, I've had several, unfortunately, learning experiences with activists. They take a whole different route to wanting to be on the board. They may start by calling you up and say, "Hi, I'm Paul Elliott. I'd like to talk to you about your company." But that's a whole different bailiwick.
Well, Gail and Jen, this has been a great session. I want to move us over to the case scenario, and this will be a really fun exercise for everybody. So let me just share a little bit about how we'll get over there. But thank you so much, Gail and Jen, for joining us this morning.